Demo tier list 2.0. All right, this time I remembered the Radiant Knights. I updated it. So let's go over the tiers really quick. Very OP, borderline breaks the game completely. Minimal, if any, weaknesses. OP, just stronger than other options. Really good output. Just generally can do like damage, heal, utility, whatever at a very high level that is really good to use. A tier for strong. These are kind of just always good to use. There's no downside to using them, or there's few downsides. B tier is good. They have some pros and some cons. C tier is okay. They have some pros, but more cons than B tier. And then I got rid of D tier because I don't think anything really belongs in D tier at this point. I reserve things like D and F tier for games where things are truly so abysmal they can't function. But in the case of most modern games, things tend to at least be like C, like low C, high D performance on the worst end of things, like on the worst end. So generally, I think it's fine to exclude D tier because I think I put Hoplite in there anyways. All right, very OP. Feather Sword is very overpowered. It can fly. It has 2 active and passive points. It has 2 accessory slots and a shield slot. It can easily hit 4 passive points. It can damage boost your team. It can spam pursuit. It can equip Runic Blade to kill armors with high initiative. It can scale its own initiative. It can scale its own accuracy. It can reduce enemy evasion while increasing its own. It can reduce enemy defense while increasing its own. It comes with some of the most OP weapons in the game. They can give avoid +10, hit +10. And then it also has that on a shield and a sword, so it gets avoid hit +20 and can switch to different weapons. It can target enemy backline that are undefended by shield units, so if there's just enemies in the backline, it can just target and kill them, often one-shotting them. If you damage boost this thing with the 5 strength boosters, which can be purchased from the Angel Shop, as long as you have the Divine Shards, it's very strong for damage. It also is very strong for support. You can do things like Flying Wild Rush, where you have a knight on your team and you can wild rush right to bosses while flying. And it's also fast and moves fast. There's almost no downside to this class. Its only real downside is that archers counter it, but you can have another class block it, and then that's not a weakness at all. So that's really its only downside. Some people will claim it has low damage. They're just not damage fixing it, frankly. It's not hard to do that. All you have to do to damage fix it is just give it those strength boosters. And if you want to run it on Runic, you can give it magic boosters instead, if you want to keep it on Runic. But yeah, 2 attacks, 2 passive points. It can block things. It can make itself faster, initiative-wise. It's already insanely fast. It's just really good. There's no downside to this class at all. It's just one of the best classes in the demo. Paladin, I think, is kind of similar, but with worse stats because he doesn't level. Now, you can strength boost Joseph, and maybe that bumps him up to very OP. But if it's worth it or not is debatable, so I'll leave him an S. You could do this, but if he levels up and his levels are bad because he might have bad base stats because he's a promoted class early, that might be the case, so it might not be a good long-term investment. But he's kind of like here. He's like in between. He's definitely OP in the demo. Later on, he might fall off, like as we get to the middle game, and this might stay good or fall off as well. We don't know yet because it's still just the demo. But I would say Paladin is like OP. Cleric, I almost want to put in S tier. I'll put it above Joseph, though. So Cleric can give something 1 to 2 action points, depending on the build. It can spot heal. It can cleanse any debuff from a row. It can apply protection to a row. It can resurrect. It has all these crazy utility items that affect rows of allies. And the protection to a row is a 50% damage reduction per ally affected. So each one of those allies takes half damage for a single hit, which completely counteracts things like an enemy Griffin Knight. If the enemy Griffin Knight goes to swing, now they take half damage. So if the Griffin Knight could kill anything, now it doesn't. Typically, unless it's like a cav. Maybe it still will kill a cav, but probably not. But yeah, this is a pretty good class for utility. It fits into any team comp. There's really no downside to using it if you're using it correctly. The worst case scenario is it heals things while giving them more action points, which is really valuable. So it's OP. Radiant Knight, I think, is just strong. It's really good with Knights because Knights boost cav damage bonus, or boost cav attack by 20%, and it stacks and it lasts the entire battle. They have lower initiative than cavs, are then knights. So knights typically will do their attacks and then boost whatever row they're in. So if you have a radiant knight with 2 knights on either side, the knights will typically both do their attacks and give 2 20% damage bonuses to the radiant knight, up to 40%, so that when the radiant knight attacks, it can deal good damage. Now, it has higher magic attack than physical, so it's a great rune sword user, but it has good enough physical attack that it can deal meaningful damage on physical. It can also negate incoming enemy offensive spells, excluding hexes from Shaman, and I did test this. So you cannot prevent Shaman attacks, but you can prevent like enemy wizard attacks. You can prevent enemy witch attacks. So you can keep like a frontliner pretty safe from magic. So it's basically like a magic tank, and it also has high magic defense. So it's a pretty good utility. You could argue it's S tier. Its mobility is 300, so it is as good as knights. Its availability is really the thing that hurts it in the demo. Now, if we're just playing the game normally, by the time we get the Radiant Knight, we're like barely through the beginning of the game. So we would have more of them, and maybe it's S tier, just because it has the damage scaling. The row heal, you also have to consider it's more reactionary. And what do I mean by that? So like things that focus on like cleansing and healing and tanking typically are trading fast actions that could have just killed or stopped the enemies to react to what the enemy's doing. So it might be the case that the best team comps don't even allow the enemies to do things. So things like row heal aren't very useful if you just have a team that just has high initiative and just kills the enemy before they can really do anything. That might just be better. And that's been my experience playing the demo, is the teams that just kill and freeze and shut down and drop enemies quickly tend to do the best because they just don't let the enemies respond. So I think Radiant Knight right now is like A tier. Gladiator. Actually, let's do Arbalist. Arbalist, I don't even think we can run. I'll just put it in B tier for now, because I don't think we have access to it. Gladiator. So Gladiator's basic attack has 75% accuracy. It's very difficult to get this thing hitting. It does hit hard when it hits, but its accuracy is kind of bad. Now, it does heal when it gets hit, which can be valuable, and the only real weakness it has is like calves for like damage scaling. So I don't know. I think it's just C tier. I don't think it's very good. I think Griffin Knight's better. Its row attack is nice, but the accuracy is bad. The heal is okay, but it's vulnerable to certain things that would require it to be defended, whereas an Avoid Tank Thief would just, or Avoid Tank something else, would just basically be a better frontliner to prevent basic melee attacks from getting through. I don't really think it brings anything of value that other things don't do better. The healing to tank is fine. It just feels too vulnerable to things, and its attack is kind of bad. Its initiative is low as well. Those are like the main issues I have with it. Griffin Knight. Do we put it in S or A? Honestly, I'm going to put Griffin in A. So its best build right now, in my opinion, is reliant on a witch buffing it. So let's start there. First of all, yeah, so if its best build is completely contingent on something else buffing it, that is more of it being leveraged by the witch than it leveraging the witch. Because the witch could freeze up to 2 people a combat, or even more if you like battery it with a cleric. But a witch with high initiative can freeze like any target, unless it gets blocked, of course. But similarly, so like the Griffin Knight, here's what the Griffin Knight does. It flies, it can do a sweep attack, like a row attack, on the front or back rank, because it's ranged. It can kind of avoid tank frontline, but it has very low HP, so sometimes it can die to assists as well, which can be annoying. So it can die to like archer spam assist, if that's a thing. That is a serious problem, especially if it catches a stray crit from an archer assist. That's also a huge problem. There's not really good ways of dealing with that if you're on a flying unit, like as your leader. So there's the wind charm, but you can't buy them. Maybe you can get like 1 to 2 in the demo to prevent these. But there's that weakness. There's the initiative problem. It needs to waste one of its passive slots to initiative fix itself so they can act sooner, because its initiative is like 10 to 15, roughly speaking, which is not very high. It's very good against calves. That's like its main draw, is that it's exceptionally good at killing cav squads. Now this is something that is semi-present in the demo, more towards the end of the demo, where there's the occasional cav squad. So in these use cases, it's definitely good. Most bosses, I don't think there's very many bosses that are cav squads. Maybe there's like 1 or 2. So if you're trying to beat maps quickly, this is not like the thing. I would say Feather Sword is typically better than this. But the freeze AoE backline nuke, while it's good, it only really was objectively useful or better than other things on the Shaman map, where there's the Shaman boss that just kind of debuffs your entire team. And a Cleric could also have dealt with that team just by cleansing the debuff. And then we would have just killed the Gladiators and killed the Cleric, or killed the Shamans. So, and even so, it didn't one round. Like, it just froze the Shamans. We killed 1 or 2 Gladiators, fought again, killed the Shamans. So it's still 2 combats. So even in its like most optimal use case, as far as I can tell, it's really just like freezing key backline threats with the help of a witch or wizard, and then going for killing cav squads, which is not always useful because it's a niche, it's a circumstantial use case, right? It's not like 100% of the time it's going to be fighting cav squads. So I think it's strong. I don't think it's OP though. It has too many weaknesses to be overpowered. It needs too much team support to get going. Some like other things can just pop off without team support. Now, if you're a utility unit, you're not being evaluated by damage. You're being evaluated by how much support you give. But this thing, I feel like, is kind of like a resource hog. Now, most things can stomp the demo, but some things stomp the demo more. Fighter, I think, is fine. It's usable. It's decent. It has some, use cases of being party leader against archer spam. Now, here's the thing with archer spam, though, for like the range assist. If you're playing very aggressively, you can beat almost every single map in a few seconds or less just by using like a cav squad or like a speed boosted feather sword squad, and especially when using wild rush. And most of the maps, you can just deploy 1 squad that has a knight, and then you just run along the road and then wild rush to the boss and kill the boss. And you can do this for almost every single map in the demo. So it's very hard for a lot of these slower teams that just can't do this to compete with things like that, because now that that is discovered and that's in the game and I can point to it and be like, look at this, look at what you can do, things like Hoplite and tank squads just aren't as valuable because you can just beat maps so damn fast. It just doesn't even matter. So, like, yes, you can probably infinite tank on Hoplite, but Thief can do it too, and it also has better damage and shutdown. Alright, Hoplite. Hoplite, I think, is just okay. I haven't heard a single compelling use case of it yet, or seen a really good build for it that is just, like, obvious and crazy and jumps out as being really good. So here's the Hoplite problem. First of all, what does it give you? So it has low damage, objectively. It has low initiative. It has decent physical tanking, but it has critical weaknesses that undermine it. It also has low mobility, so if you throw it in a squad, it lowers your mobility. So, like, let's imagine you want to dive a boss, right? And you want to build a squad that can hit through most things or almost anything and kill a boss really quickly. Hoplite does nothing for you. All it does is gives you a frontline tank that does low damage. And the best case for it, there's like some belt that allows you to counterattack with 150 physical potency. That's its best use case, but it's still much worse than other things because its own active point attacks are just so weak. It's just not worth it in most situations, and its initiative is quite poor. But also consider that if you're attacking the boss with like freeze and stuns and stuff, the boss's group doesn't really get to attack as much too. So typically the best teams can just dive bosses and kill them immediately, at least in my opinion. Now you could argue the best teams can push and hold points and kill or whatever. The teams that kill bosses can also easily kill the enemy groups because the boss groups are just simply harder. So the teams that are good at diving can rapidly grab forts, refresh their stamina. So even if you want to play slower and not like dive bosses and win quickly, you can push the roads faster because you're on a horse, assuming you have a horse mount. Now you can bring a hoplite with a horse and use it as a frontliner. That's probably its best use case. But even then, there's better things like Thief and Sword Fighter, just higher damage and can out-tank these typically. But all right, let me go over one build that someone mentioned that a lot of people liked for some reason. It was in a comment, so a lot of people seem to favor it. It was a hoplite in the front, and then 2 hunters in the back. And I've played the demo long enough to know that hunter is a very meh class that is just outclassed by other things. But the idea was that hunter uses its true strike, and then you have the hoplite use its passive points to use Gambler's coin buff on the hunters to give them plus 30% attack and plus 50% crit damage. Not crit rate, crit damage. Hunter is not known for its crit rate, and you could give it crit plus 40 with eye patches, like eye patch plus lucky coin. Not the best use of lucky coin in my opinion, but plus 50% crit damage. The funny thing is this combo would work better on Sword Fighter, who has innate like high crit. But we'll ignore that for a second. And here's the thing. Here's the problem with that build. One, armor destroys it. Enemy things that block completely hurt Hunter, and the only way they don't is if the Hunter uses something like Flame Arrow. And if you're Flame Arrowing and you're getting blocked, your crits are going to hit for almost no damage anyways, because medium guard's half damage and heavy guard's 75% damage off. And enemy hoplites and enemy fighters are going to have high defense. You're not going to really be hitting through those. So unlike mages who kill guards, Hunter is just worse than Knight in terms of damage, because Knight can sometimes kill guards off of might, but also can do assaulting lance and just keep attacking. And it also has high mobility. So the Hoplite Hunter thing, it just doesn't make any sense. There's also not even really that many good bows. Bow is typically a weak weapon. It's single targets. There are the AoE attacks. The Hunter can target two things, which situationally may be okay. But Gambler Coin Hunter seems like one of those things that it has like a few good matchups, and not even like great matchups. It just like has a few good matchups where it seems decent, and then it just suffers against other things, whereas the best things are just always good all the time. So I'm gonna also put Hunter in like low B. So it can target with ranged, but there's a lot of enemy shield units that block it and basically nullify its damage. And the only case it's really good is when it can one-shot enemy backliners, but other things can do that better. So I just don't think it's very good. Its damage is not that high either. It has 100 physical potency with low strength, which typically means that it doesn't one-shot things as you enter like the level 10 beyond missions. So like when the enemy levels are like level 10, it typically doesn't put in that much work. And using a hoplite to increase its crit damage and its attack, like 50, you also have to consider 50 crit damage, 50% more crit damage, basic attack. So like if you hit a 20 and you crit, it's 50%, so a 20 becomes a 30, and then 50 more. I don't know if it does the crit damage modifier itself. I guess that's something to look into. So let's assume either case, right? Like let's say it just gives you 50% more of the final damage. So that's 45 from 20, because 20 becomes 30, and then 50% of that's 15, so it becomes 45. So that's decent. And then for other things, if it was just the crit damage itself, so like if you get, I guess it would double. So it's either 40 or 45, I think, in that example. But you also have to consider you have to crit, right? And the crit rate would be like 40 to 50. So you have like a half a chance for this to even happen. So like the Gambler's Coin in this case is basically just like a Dancer's Bangle with this extra effect. But you also have to spend a passive point to get True Hit on Hunter. And Hunter has one active and one passive point. So it basically gets, if you Carnelian Pendant and Lapis Pendant both of your Hunters, they get 2 attacks with True Strike, have no other passives at all. They're blockable, and they have to roll for crit. It's just not a good setup. It seems like it is, but it's not. If you follow the math, it's just not there. Other things are just better. Other things have more passive and active points. They have better abilities. Housecarl, I think it's okay. Has decent damage. Its initiative is like average. Mobility's average. It's just like the definition of like a decent generalist damage dealer. People like to think of it as a physical damage nuke. That's fine. I think there's better options that do way more. It doesn't have any abilities that really jump out. It doesn't really have very good, like axes. There's also very few axes. There's a lot of swords and lances in the demo. So, and there's a lot of really good staffs, shields, swords, and lances. And there's like almost no axes and bows. So if there were more axes and bows, these classes might be better, but there's just really not that many. and the best ones are still worse than the average ones of these. Knight, I think, is very OP right now. You can easily beat almost anything with it. Knight plus anything typically wins. It's just ridiculously overpowered. It has really good damage. If it can get through enemy blockers, it can typically kill an entire enemy backline by itself easily. It also has high mobility. Wild Rush is one of the best Valor skills in the game right now because you can rush through multiple enemies. Sometimes you kill them and also level up from it. So there have been instances where I'll Wild Rush through an enemy mage tower to the boss, kill the mage tower, get a level up or two, damage the boss, and like you can just speed clear the entire game with Knight right now. It's ridiculous as hell. Wild Rush and Knight and Assaulting Lance are just so overtuned. You also can circumstantially switch to Unwavering Lance to kill thieves and griffins. You can switch to Runic Spear to kill enemy armors if those are giving you a problem. Carnelian Pendant and Battler's Buckler plus any like melee, doesn't really matter. Like there's so many good lances, and you'll just typically farm and destroy everything. This is like the easiest class to speed clear the game with right now. It does everything you want, and it has ridiculous damage. It's even better than Paladin because it can reset its own action points. So as long as you're using it correctly, it has infinite action points until the enemy dies, which is ridiculous as hell. Also, it has a lane stun. It has Wild Rush, like it has the Wild Rush Valor skill that's overpowered, and then Wild Rush, the attack that does 80 physical potency, so 80% damage reduction, or 80% base damage, so 20% reduction of a normal attack, and it can stun up to 2 targets in a column, which is pretty stupid. That's really good. Stun sets something's initiative to 0 basically, so that it eventually gets its active skill off, but late, like at the very last of like a sequence of active skills, right? Lord, I think Lord is just OP. I don't think it's very OP. It's just like it's like one of the best tanks. It can block for allies. It can reduce damage. It has good damage itself. It can run Runic to deal with armors. It can run Vipers if you want for poison, if you want to deal with armors that way, or the poison. Poison can be good against things that have multiple action points. So that's like really why you would use that. It's also percentage-based damage. Someone said it's 20%. I don't know that it's 20%. It might be. I haven't tested it, but that's what someone was saying. But really, Runic Blade can heal itself. It has access to some stupid shields and swords that just lend itself to tanking. It basically is a tank with no weaknesses, and if you're running it correctly, it shouldn't die ever, and it's just your frontliner. It can also guard your backline from archer threats, so it can protect your feather sword, it can protect knights, it can protect whatever you need to in the backline, like clerics and so on. Priestess, we don't really get to use that much. I'll put it in A tier for now. B tier. Now, it's a healer that has magic attacks, so in theory it's good, but we just don't know enough about it, so you could say it's A or B. We get to use it for like a small fraction of the demo, so it's hard to say how good it is, so I'll just default things that I don't know to B tier. Shaman. Some people love Shaman. I'm kind of on the fence on it. I don't think it's bad. I think most people would probably put it in S or A tier. So here's what Shaman does. Shaman debuffs enemies. It has 2 big row debuffs. One reduces an enemy initiative, and it reduces their passive points by 1, so it can directly hurt enemy like heals, enemy guards. It can get you through. All right, so here's why I don't think Shaman is as good as other things, like Witch. I think Witch and Wizard are just much better. So Shaman can cripple enemy offense and allow your team to become tankier as a result. However, if you just simply kill the threats, freeze the threats, or damage boost allies with magic, like Magic Conferral or something, you can also get through armors that way in the case of removing block. You can also debuff, like you can just block attacks or just evade tank instead of needing to not get hit. So I think Shaman is actually B tier. I don't think it's that good. I know it seems really strong because of its debuffs, but killing and shutting down the enemy before they do things is typically better. So like freezing and stunning is just stronger than debuffing because preventing an action in the first place is better than reducing its effect. So I just don't think it's as good as other things. Sellsword. So Sellsword does have big damage, and it does have a repeat attack like Knight. However, it does not have Wild Rush and does not have the mobility of Knight. It has worse availability, which doesn't really matter too much. I'll put it in S tier. I'll put it in like low S. I still think it has value. It's not as good as Knight, but it does have things it can do that are quite good. And it has the repeat attack, and it also has like 150 physical potency attack, and it can use its active and passive points to attack and deal damage, which is huge value. Whereas with Knight, it typically uses its passive points to damage boost, but its damage boost lasts, like when it damage boosts itself, it lasts the entire fight. And it also affects other horse units specifically. So other, paladins, radiant knights, and so on. So Knight is kind of just like, it's better than Sellsword because it has mobility, it has Wild Rush, and it has a self-damage boost. Sellsword is really strong though. I do think it belongs in S tier because it has all these different abilities to attack, and it's just a really good backliner for just dealing really huge physical damage. It's basically House Carl, but better. This is Sellsword at home, I think. Soldier. Soldier, I think, is like here. I think you can't go wrong running a soldier, but there's always better options. Soldier can do a little bit of everything, and it's on lances, so it can unwavering true attack, which is very nice. It can radiant lance for a radiant spear for more damage against armors to kind of like punch through armors. It can be like a buff. It just like buffs things. So for example, it could use Dancer's Call on Knight to damage boost it, which is very useful. It can spot heal with first aid. It can lane nuke with 150 physical potency, so it can hit a column for good damage, often killing enemy backliners while damaging the frontliners if there's not blocking units on the enemy team or blocking characters. So it can kind of do a little bit of everything. It doesn't excel in anything. Like Griffin Knight obviously excels in some things. This is just like a really strong generalist. You can like pretty much run safely into any team comp as like a utility spot healer / damage booster / damage dealer. It also gets Javelin, which allows it to target enemy Griffins. Griffin Knights have double avoid versus melee ground attacks, so Javelin actually bypasses this double avoid and allows Soldier to target Griffins for increased accuracy because it's ranged. They also can target enemy like healers, witches that are undefended with Javelin, which is kind of nice. So it's kind of just like a good filler class. You can't really go wrong running it. It's like, I wouldn't run more than more than one, but it's pretty solid. I mean, I used it on a team comp that speed cleared the entire demo in expert mode with 2.5 hours remaining. So if it was good enough to do that, it's at least 8. Now, it was definitely one of the weaker classes of that team comp, and maybe Elaine was as well. Maybe I could have dropped these and use this situationally. Thief, I think, is fair to put in like high S. So what does Thief do? So, well, maybe not high S. Maybe like here. Maybe like mid S. So Thief can hit high avoid. It can reduce enemy passive points, which can help get through enemy tanks, remove guard so that backliners are no longer defended. It can also evade tank and avoid tank. So evade the actual skill and avoid being like the evasion % chance of dodging. So with Silk Scarf and Lucky Coin, it's basically unhittable by anything but true strikes. So it can just sit on the front line and just deny all enemy melee attacks to your backline and passive steal key threats or key targets. It also cheeses the boss. So it removes like all these passive points from the boss and just makes that fight much easier. But it's pretty much always good to use. Its damage is on the lower side though. It can get okay damage with poison, but then you're not doing the passive steal. It also has an active ability that lets it poison things at range, which is kind of nice. So if you can poison some things at range and then they act, they can typically die from that if other damage hits them. But the poison usually doesn't kill on its own, needs some help from something else. Sword Fighter? Sword Fighter is really good. I think it's like here. I think it's about as good as Elaine almost. It can't block though. So it has true attacks, it has crits, it has opening attacks, it can reset its action points and passive points conditionally. The only problem with it is that it has negative synergy with parry and avoid tanking. So it has this ability parry that negates a melee attack, but it will not function if you avoid tank. And these things are evasive, like they have 40 avoid. 40 evasion. So you typically want to throw like Lucky Coin plus the Silk Scarf on them, kind of similar to a Thief. They're basically Thief, but more damage. They have way more damage than Thief. They can use both their passive and active points to deal damage. Thief has better sustain and more utility, but less damage. These have way more damage. A lot more. It's not even funny how much more. Like, they can open the fight with one-shotting something with a crit, for example. That's like a thing they can do easily. But they can run crit builds, they can run avoid builds, they could also probably be like backlaners or backliners as well. But they have high damage, high avoid. They're kind of a combination of like Thief and Sellsword. They don't have the repeat attack though. The only way they can really reset is if they parry, and parry is kind of finicky because they have high avoid. So typically what will happen is you'll make them either a crit thing or an avoid tank, and they'll just pop off. They're pretty good. They're pretty good frontliner. They can replace a lane when you don't need the blocking, because then they can just sit in the front and deal tons. They can typically outdamage him by a huge, like in a huge way. So I think they belong in S. Witch I think belongs in S. Witch can do a lot. It can freeze a key threat, so you can initialize initiative boost a witch, so that it can act soon or almost near, like, you know, in the front of the pack before enemies. It can freeze a key threat, and then if nothing else attacks that threat, if you're not like say for example you can't kill a boss in one combat, you can freeze the boss or like a thing that's hurting your team, like a tank or whatever, and then have your team ignore frozen, like never attack frozen, and they can attack around that, and then it'll stay frozen the entire fight. It can also give Griffin an AoE like cleave freeze through the ice tome, which you can get from the Witch's Tower. The Witch's Tower it's in the hamlet. Like when you do the witch quest, there's two villages. There's the village in the swamp, and then there's the village to the left of the swamp, and there's a Witch's Tower. Go up to the Witch's Tower, talk to the tower, and she'll be like, oh, this is my house. And then she'll get a tome that costs 2 passive points to apply magic conferral and a freeze. And it works on AoE attacks, so that allows Griffin to AoE backline or frontline freeze. So that's like the big combo. This is why I bumped Griffin Knight up, was because of Witch, really. But Witch can give things magic damage on their attacks. Like magic conferral can help units hit through like guards, basically, like tanks, or just damage boost them in general. It can freeze things, and it can give allies freeze. It also has other things it can do. I think at level 15 it gives True Hit to an ability for 1 passive point, if I recall correctly. But ignoring that, like just the freeze. Also, if you run Carnelian Pendant on this thing, it can freeze 2 things, which is huge value. And the damage is good, and it typically can one-shot armors. So it basically is an armor killer, damage booster, utility unit that can heavily play. Oh yeah, it also can teleport you to any allied unit or facility. So you can send like a unit in, like let's say you have a unit that gets the boss that can't kill the boss, that just like rush the boss down as fast as humanly possible to get to the boss, and then you can teleport to that. Or if you have a guard tower, like let's say you have a push team who just pushes to the boss, grabs a guard tower, or they're just there, you can teleport directly to that unit and then kill the boss with your witch team. But the witch teleport is pretty ridiculous, and I've used it on certain maps to instantly cheese a boss. I'll send like a squad that's just like a bunch of knights with like a griffin that can't really kill the boss to the boss, and then I'll teleport to that and then beat the boss instantly. So teleport, freezes, AoE cleave freeze with Griffin and other classes that can AoE, like they can column attack or row attack. The magic conferral damage is huge. It also has other things it can do, but pretty good class for all those reasons. Wizard, I feel like, is like Witch at home. It has some good damage. It has better damage than Witch for sure, but Witch has utility and shutdown. Witch has teleport, and Witch has freeze. Now, I'm pretty sure you can give the Wizard the freeze tome, but Wizard's attack, Fireball, does not freeze innately. So freeze tome plus a freeze, you can cleave freeze a group of enemies and then freeze something else, and the entire enemy team is at your mercy, and you can pick apart and attack them in whichever sequence you need to kill them, typically. Or just to kill the key threats and keep the other things frozen that you don't want to kill. So, yeah, like Witch is ridiculous because of its crowd control. But Wizard, really high damage. The magic assist on both Witch and Wizard is quite good. I don't really run it though. I feel like you're better off just running some super team that can dive bosses, which is not hard to make. It's almost like the game wants you to do this. But Wizard, if it had innate freeze, I would put it with Witch or Shutdown, but it has more damage. So if you just want something to kill enemy tanks, Wizard is your dude. It also has like the magic counter, which hits really hard. Fireball tends to like nuke down hoplites and fighters, and then the burn it applies will kill them if the initial attack doesn't. So quite strong. Then finally we have Warrior. Warrior, I think, is like low A tier. So its attacks are unguardable, and it has a completely armor ignoring like Hoplite fighter killer attack, which is good, but its repeat attack is just okay. And overall, there's not really good axes, so I would say lances are probably the best weapon type. I don't know if I think Knight might be better than this. Yeah, I think Knight's better. Lances are like one of the better ones. Lances and swords are better, and then axes and hammers are kind of like down here. They're just not as good. Now, there are other things it can do, but its repeat attack is not as good as Sellsword. I don't think its damage is as high. Same thing with Knight. Knight can damage boost itself, like as part of its kit. It doesn't need to like set up some specific thing. It can just convert its own action or its own passive points into a damage boost. It's basically just like a worse version of Sellsword, I think. But Sellsword suffers against armored, but you can always just equip Runic Blade. So it's almost like its ability to kill armored is situationally good, but outside of that, it's just worse than Sellsword and Knight for damage. And it's a fine class, like it's still strong. I just don't think it's that good. Or it's not that it's not that good. Compared to S tiers, it's not as good. But compared to these, it's much better. So here's the list for now. We have Knight and Feather Sword and very OP. Lord, Sword Fighter, Witch, Cleric, Thief, Paladin, Sellsword, and S. A tier, we have Wizard, Griffin, Soldier, Radiant Knight, Warrior. B, we have Shaman, Priestess. Priestess, we just don't know about. Fighter, Housecarl, Arbalist, we also don't know about. Hunter, and then Gladiator, Hoplite. These just have too many downsides. I'm sure you can get them working, but if you get these working, you will destroy the game easily. And if you get these working, you will not. I mean, you probably could throw these on like a super squad and then claim they're good, but they're not going to help the super squad. Like the super squad's key components will be what's winning the battles, and they'll just kind of be like along for the ride. I was actually trying to theory craft like a Gladiator cleave, but the problem with Gladiator is it needs hit fixed, it needs initiative fixed, it needs to not be blocked, it needs a row of enemies that can attack in the front, which is very rare because most enemy team comps typically will have like a shield in the front, or most of them will be behind, and there'll be like a thief or whatever in the front. And the things it is good against, everything's good against. So like if it like super cleaves like a group of enemy soldiers where there's like a group of 3 soldiers, like literally any of these will kill those easily. So it's not impressive to do that. So it almost seems like it's just like a bad class right now. Same thing with like Hoplite. There's really no reason to run a Hoplite. Against archer spam, I would rather use a fighter, like if I want to have a team leader to reduce like range assists, for example, or even just run units that can tank it and then just heal afterwards. You can just use like a healing font and then just kill, or you can even do this. You use a flyer plus a wild rush and wild rush through, sometimes often one-shotting the enemy archer squads with wild rush and just wild rush through like 3 archer squads and kill them all out of combat so you don't even get assisted, like the archer assist. But this is the tier list. Definitely let me know if you agree or disagree with any of these and why. Currently, I've not seen compelling arguments for the classes in B and C tier. And the A tiers, I feel like, are pretty fair. S tiers, this is based on, like, these I'm basing on, like, how easily I can get a squad into just, like, beating maps, like, near immediately or instantly. In some cases, if the fort is close enough, you can just wild rush directly to the boss before the timer even counts down and kill the boss immediately. So this is just super high performance compared to these. But yeah, that's it for this one. Definitely subscribe. Peace.